So a little bit about myself. I am a psychiatrist right now, living and working in Manhattan, New York. Um, I used to actually live in Toronto, Canada. That's where I was born, but I've been living in New York for about 5 years now. When I was 18 years old, my best friend went to NYU, and when I stepped foot in New York, I just realized that this is the city for me. Of course, most people know that this has been a very difficult year. New York has been hit very hard by the pandemic as well as the racial justice movement, but I feel very blessed and fortunate that I get to practice here and, develop my career in this amazing city.
Yes, thank you for honestly sharing that with us. We're glad to hear that you're also Canadian. We're here in Toronto as well. I grew up in the U.S., so this is a great connection for me. What prompted you to become a psychiatrist?
So when I was growing up, I actually didn't have any exposure to psychiatry. In fact, I really didn't know what mental health was because it wasn't a topic that was really discussed in my house. I can remember going through mental health issues, like when I was extremely distraught after losing my high school sweetheart, being in my room, writing in my journal, door closed though, because I didn't want anybody in my family to know that I was going through that pain. There was like a sense of shame towards it. Yeah. So it really wasn't until I went into medical school, when I was working in a hospital in Brooklyn, actually, that I got inspired to pursue the career in psychiatry. So while I was there, I saw patients coming in with very severe mental illness, schizophrenia, people with bipolar disorder and a manic episode, depression that led to suicidality. I remember I had one patient who was speaking illogically, not sleeping at all. And we were really stumped as to what was going on. And it took almost 3 weeks of us developing a relationship to really recognize that this person had just been using K2. They were self-medicating with substances. And K2 is something that doesn't come up on urine toxicology screening. So we had no idea that he was on any substances. But regardless, it's really a specialty that takes patience and takes a lot of empathy. And you really need to develop a relationship with your patient, because if you don't, then they're not going to be vulnerable with you. And then you're not going to really get that strong connection to help them through their process and give them the right treatment. So that's kind of how I got into psychiatry. It was a process that was pretty clear to me because it just made sense. Psychiatry really worked with me. But my journey to become a doctor was a lot less clear, actually. When I was growing up, I was more of a creative person. I actually was interested in fashion. I used to stay up really late at night and I would cut up all my mother's clothing and sew them back together to like modernize it. And like, I loved it. It was a way for me to express myself creatively. But my parents, they just could not understand that career choice. They assumed that I just wouldn't be able to take care of myself if I went down the fashion career pathway. So they really kind of pushed me into a career in medicine. And that initially made me not want to pursue it at all. So a little bit about my parents is that they are first generation immigrants to Toronto. They're actually from Trinidad and Tobago. And when they first came to Canada, they were living in an area of concentrated disadvantage. So they saw the world from a place of scarcity, and they really experienced the trauma of poverty that's common to the immigrant experience. So as a way to protect me or protect their kids from that trauma, they placed a lot of pressure on us to be successful. And, I really didn't think that I had what it took to be a doctor. When I was in those pre-med courses, nobody looked like me. I think there were like 6 other Black females in that course. So when you look around and no one looks like you, there's a very little ability for you to picture yourself in that career. But My Tobagonian mother was very persistent, and she just wanted to ensure that I didn't have to struggle like her. And she knew me, and she knew that I was capable of it, and she reminded me of it daily.
See, that's powerful. That's powerful. Honestly, I can understand where you're coming from with that. Coming from a first generation Caribbean household as well. My family's from St. Vincent. It was a lot of go to school, you're either a doctor, you're a lawyer. So when I told them that I wanted to embark on French translation, she's like, hold on, what can you do with this? And that instills a little fear, you know, especially in children or young adults trying to figure out their life. So I'm so happy to hear that your mom was like, listen, you can do this, you got this.
Oh yeah, no,
don't worry about it.
not ever going to let me do it. Particularly because if it ever came from a point of me believing that I couldn't do it, that was just not an option for her. You know, she had gone through so much and was able to create something. So her daughter was not gonna, you know, go have that mentality. And you know what really struck me actually is Naomi Osaka. She just won the US Open. Did you see that quote?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so it was like, I have to thank my ancestors because every time I'm reminded that their blood runs through my veins, I'm reminded that I cannot lose. And that is really the experience sometimes of a second generation immigrant. Like truly seeing the journey and what they've gone through. I mean, we can't lose, right?
That's real. That's real, honestly. And that's something that our co-founder, Kim, and myself go through every day. It's like, we can do this, we got this, and we're definitely going to support the community along the way. So let's dive into a little bit about trauma. Can you define what that is? How do you define it in your own terms?
Yeah. So trauma is actually the body's adaptive response to a very distressing or problematic or overwhelming situation. So an important thing to realize is that trauma response is very subjective, meaning that not everybody is going to react to the same situation the same. Something in my background may cause me to have a trauma response to an event, whereas you may not have that same reaction. So it's so important to recognize the subjectivity within the trauma response. But regardless, things that really cause trauma can be anything. It can be a nasty comment like cyberbullying. It can be seeing unarmed Black men being killed at the hands of the police, being passed around on social media. It can be like the story yesterday of knowing that an unarmed Black woman was sleeping in her bed and justice is still not served. That is extremely traumatic. You don't have to be the one who actually goes through that accident, that injury, to actually be very disturbed and traumatized by something. So there are a lot of different things that can trigger that trauma response. Mm-hmm. But what's really important is understanding how does trauma live in our body and what is that traumatized body? So when a person is confronted with a real or perceived threat, the message is actually immediately sent to this area in the brain called the emotional center. It's called the amygdala. And as soon as it gets there, fear is excited, right? And as soon as fear is excited, then we get this trauma response, the fight, flight, or freeze. I think a lot of people know the fight or flight response. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so in the fight or flight response, what happens is the sympathetic nervous system gets activated. Cortisol rushes through our body. What does cortisol do? It adapts us to try and fight or flight. It prepares us to defend ourselves. Mm-hmm. So our muscles become tense, our heart becomes racing so that oxygen goes to every cell in our body. We're ready to fight off whatever it is, or we're ready to flee. It's an adaptive response. It actually happened, in prehistoric times when we really were running from lions and tigers, right? And this all happens in milliseconds. Before our conscious mind is even aware of this, this has already been triggered. Milliseconds, right? It's so adaptive in us. But I think that the response that a lot of people are not, the one that's a bit more misunderstood is the freeze response, right? So this occurs when a situation, it really overwhelms our ability to cope to the point where fear literally leaves us paralyzed. So in these fearful situations, you have really just decided that you can't you can't run from this danger. And there are situations where that added boost of cortisol is just not going to help you, right? It's not, no matter how much you fight or flee, that threat is just there and you can't do it, right?
Yeah.
So in this instance, the freezing, the numbing, the dissociation is really, the dissociation from the here and now is the only way to protect yourself. So by freezing your emotions, it actually protects yourself from being overwhelmed by such immense feelings of fear. And that actually can be protective of your psyche. The freeze response is just as adaptive as the fight or flight.
Yeah, so I'm actually glad that you brought that up. During my childhood, I experienced extreme trauma. Just both seeing things that were traumatic or being in traumatic situations. And I noticed that my response was to flee, was to suppress, and was to ignore. And that was the way I went throughout my whole life until adulthood. Mm-hmm. So how that manifested in me was really just extreme shyness, extreme, just feeling like tense. Mm-hmm. And I would be like the funny girl, but I was holding all that back inside. So it's really amazing that you see that that's a scientific response to the body. Because I just thought like, okay, this is just my personality. I'm avoidant, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Totally. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. So does the trauma impact children and adults in a similar fashion?
So, you know, the thing is that like children are definitely more at risk of being traumatized by distressing situations. And that's just because, you know, the trauma response really occurs when that fear is activated because you don't have that ability to cope. And of course, children have never developed an ability to cope. They don't have those abilities that we have. If you were to call me a bad name, if you were to tell me that I was nothing or that, you know, you didn't care about me, I would have my Tobagonian mother in my head saying, Chanelle, you know, don't listen to the other Chanelle here. You got this, you can do it. You know, that's my coping mechanism. But like children just don't have that. So if you have a little boy who's sitting at the, you know, the kitchen table and he's trying to do his math homework and his father, his primary caregiver, the person that is his be all end all, right, starts telling him that he's stupid, that he can't do it, that's going to be extremely traumatizing. But he didn't have that coping mechanism that I would have. And so for him, that overwhelming feeling of fear, that overwhelming feeling of being uncared for, unloved, abandoned, that is too much for a little child's psyche. And so children who are traumatized are much more likely to go to the freeze in terms of all of those, because they can't fight. You can't fight your father. You can't run away from your father's home where you're sleeping and getting food. The only thing you can do is dissociate, numb yourself, freeze, right? And interestingly enough, people who do have that freeze response are more likely to actually develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, an extreme form of trauma that we see with people who are traumatized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I want to talk a little bit about how that works when you deal with that as a child and you deal with it and it's never resolved. What happens to the adult? And I know we'll talk about that a little later, but I want to know, like, what happens exactly to the adult? Can they kind of stick in those same patterns, or do you see something magically happening after they hit a certain age?
Yeah, right. I mean, so in terms, like as a psychiatrist, we live by the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. So I'm going to turn to that right now to really describe trauma in the adult. So when the most common psychiatric disorders from the fight, flight, or freeze response is acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. And the symptoms associated with both have to do with the body's, trauma response. So acute distress disorder is defined by like 5 main symptoms. The first thing is that you have to have had some sort of trauma that elicited fear and that, trauma response. Then the next thing that happens is you start to have intrusive thoughts, like intrusive thoughts about that trauma. You might have nightmares that make your sleep unbearable. You might actually have flashbacks during the day of bringing you right back to that same traumatic time. Another one thing that changes, or the second thing that changes, is that you have an overall negative mood and an inability to really experience positive emotion, right? Another thing is the dissociative symptoms, feeling like you're very detached from the world, or feeling like you're experiencing yourself on the outside, like you're kind of like here, but you're experiencing yourself on the outside, this depersonalization. Another thing is that we start to actually avoid anything that reminds us of that trauma. And so you can imagine that if your trauma had to do with anything outside of your home, I mean, your world just becomes so much smaller because you start avoiding everything because you don't want to feel that pain.
Yeah.
Another thing that happens is that you have this overall sense of unease, and that comes from that activation, the activation of that trauma response. So you constantly feel keyed up. You might startle very easily. Someone taps you on the shoulder, and you might turn around because you're just constantly uneased. So those are the type of things that happen in acute stress response. So it's estimated that about like 5 to 20% of people who have been traumatized will develop acute stress disorder.
Yeah.
And about half of those people will go on to PTSD. So acute stress disorder becomes PTSD when the symptoms last more than a month. And as I said, PTSD, same symptoms as acute stress disorder, but they just last longer. And PTSD can be short-lived. It could actually be 5 months or a year, or it could be chronic, lasting, a decade.
Yeah, honestly, you're reading my whole life right now. I'm just sitting there like, oh my gosh. This whole thing is everything I've gone through. And I'm seeing in the chat as well that others are feeling the same way. Susanna says, I love this conversation so far. I remember realizing that my most common trauma response was to freeze. And another one I just learned is that I eventually started responding was fawn. Can you explain what fawn is? Do you know what fawn is exactly? Fawning?
Fawn? I actually don't know.
I don't.
Can you explain that
Okay, so you teach us, Susanna, honestly. Basically what she was doing was people pleasing. And excessive taking care, profusely apologizing. And I think that's a way to definitely cope so that you don't have to deal with any extra trauma, to be honest. For myself, like I said, you've read my whole world. And a lot of the times I do, as an adult, even after therapy, have those just random thoughts, flashbacks. And then I just kind of suppress it like, oh girl, like that's done. We took care of that. Please leave it alone. And that's just a way to kind of get through the day.
So I can do, right? Because
to avoid.
You're you would just become overwhelmed if you were to try to experience those things constantly. And if it's not a
Exactly.
healthy environment for you to process it in that moment, that's actually a very adaptive and a very safe thing to do, is just to avoid it in that moment. But of course, we can't do that all the time, you know?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I think even conversations like these and the conversations I have with my friends are therapeutic with safe people that will, respond to you safely.
Yep.
You can't trust everybody with that information, but yeah, definitely not. So I want to launch a poll right now. I want to know a little bit more about those that are with us tonight. Here we go. Do you have experience with severe childhood trauma? So yeah, the poll is moving quite quickly.
Definitely.
77% of us have had severe childhood trauma.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of people don't realize that this is kind of normal. The person that you look at next to you might have had similar experiences to you.
Totally.
A
Totally.
lot of the times when you deal with traumatic situations, we think we are alone. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's subjective too, right? So you and I may not have had the same event happen to us, but that trauma response, the adaptive response that is intrinsic to all of us, a survival response, has been activated. And, you know, I hope that we do get to this later on, the adverse childhood experiences, but like 1 in 5, I think it's actually half of children in the US have had some sort of adverse childhood experience or a trauma in childhood. So it is very common.
Yeah. Can you explain to us the inner child theory?
Yeah, the basis of this whole chat, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Let's get right to it. So the inner child theory, in my training, the inner child theory is so important to understand for therapy. So
Mm,
the inner child is kind of this metaphor that's used to describe the parts of our brain where our childhood memories are stored.
yeah.
So the inner child is the inner child represents the child that we once were, right? It's all these memories that are still in us, that are still a part of us, and that still can affect our behaviors and emotions. Um, so the inner child really holds our capacity for all those things that happened in childhood, our playfulness, our innocence, our joy, our curiosity, all those things that are a part of childhood. But it's not always positive, right? Look at this poll. We just saw that there are a lot of trauma in childhood. So the inner child within us also is the accumulation of childhood hurts, the childhood traumas, um, fears, angers from childhood. So that inner child can be a part of our conscious mind. We can be very much aware of that child. But a lot of our inner child, a lot of those memories are actually stored on our unconscious mind, really out of our reach, but have a huge impact on our behaviors, our thoughts, our emotions.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the things that a lot of us don't realize is that our inner child is still right here,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have to do a lot of work to please that child, to acknowledge that child.
Yeah.
Something that I do that I stopped doing after childhood was like riding bikes,
Mm.
going for super long walks, just walking aimlessly.
Writing.
Yeah, that was my thing. Like, honestly, I would go all over town. I'd pick up some friends. We'd go. And it's just like, I need those moments again. I
Yeah.
find as soon as I have that like therapeutic moment of going for a bike ride, the rest of the day is great.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Uh,
so important to like connect with your inner child, really find out like and nurture it, right?
yeah,
Having moments of just like pure playfulness and pure joy, anything
yeah,
that kind of reminds you or connects you to, you know, those good parts of your childhood are so important right now for our mental health, for sure.
That's real. That's real. Yeah, I have somebody in here that's a family member watching, and they need to remember that their joy was drawing. Bring it back, you
Yeah,
know.
get it. Yeah, for
Let's
sure.
call them out. They don't need to know. So how would you describe the importance of that inner child connection? And how does it play in like the wellness and healing of adults?
Yeah. So like as I said in my training, understanding the inner child is really important. And then helping your, you know, your client or your patient really understand their inner child is super important. I mean, understanding your inner child really will allow you to understand just why you do the things that you do. How powerful is that, right? And a large part of becoming a healthy adult, having healthy, you know, healthy behaviors is about acknowledging that inner child, accepting that inner child, the playfulness, but also the hurt, and really taking responsibility for loving and parenting that inner child, really helping and healing it, right? Taking ownership of it and finding the right treatment that you need to heal. Those are all really important parts. So unfortunately, for most adults, it never happens though. For most adults, rather than acknowledging the inner child, because there are so many painful parts, we just suppress it and we repress it. We allow it to just be maintained on our unconscious mind because it's not, you know, in our conscious every single day. But as I said, our unconscious mind has a huge impact on our behaviors and emotions. And it doesn't, we unfortunately don't even know that it's happening. Isn't that, it's pretty wild that
Yeah.
such a huge part of us we don't have control over because it lives in our unconscious mind.
Yeah, that is so real, honestly, and something to keep in mind when we're doing little self-care acts to kind of help you get through any feelings that you have. Just remembering that your body needs it. Your body's holding all that tension, all that trauma, and to release it as much as possible is really, really the goal.
Yes.
So I want to ask a quick chat question. How does your childhood trauma impact your actions throughout your adulthood? So some already answered this question, but I want to kind of dive deeper into it. So I saw Karen says, pleasing, and excessive taking care with classic examples of unresolved trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Somebody said fawning is related to codependency. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something that they definitely hit the nail on the head, was fawning.
Mm-hmm.
Fear, scarcity mindset, not trusting others. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think for myself, like, again, it's a lot of avoidance, but it's also a lot of like pent up anger, you
Mm-hmm.
know, especially towards those that were around during the traumatic times. It's like, okay, well, why didn't you show up for me? Why, you know, and you just have those feelings that, you know, you're not really talking about, but you're thinking it. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And a lot of times kids actually feel like they are the cause of the trauma. You know, like kids actually have a very narcissistic view of the world.
Yeah.
Everything is because of them. And so if you grew up believing that the divorce that happened in your family was because of you, because you know, the parent in your house that was addicted to substance was because of you, you're
Yeah.
going to feel like you are the cause of all this hurt and pain. So you're going to have a very low sense of self-worth, right? And so you go through your life constantly vying for the love and affection of other people because, you know, you have done such bad things in your life. So I need that love to make me feel like I'm not a bad person.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of fawning might come from. I don't want to speak on other people's trauma, but that is a pattern that I have seen working with some of the people that I have with trauma.
Yeah, great. I'm just gonna say a couple more of these. Afraid of confrontation, afraid of inflicting inflicting the same emotional trauma on others.
Mm-hmm.
Trust issues, fear, anger, putting others' needs before my own. Yeah. Yeah. Tension and inability to relax.
Oh, yep. And the thing is, some of those emotions can live together. There can be rage and sadness. There can be fear and, all these things together, so complex. And those can all come up to the conscious mind. But we really need to process what's happening in the unconscious mind to start to really heal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you briefly introduce, I think you did introduce the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Did you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just kind of said that, adverse childhood experiences are very common.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So yeah, the adverse childhood experience study was probably one of the biggest studies. It was actually put on by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, the pharmaceutical company. And yeah, this was one of the largest investigations of childhood adverse experiences. And what they really wanted to see was trauma in childhood. What does that lead to in adulthood? So they, I think that they actually surveyed like 17,000 people in California. They were all middle-class Americans. And they did physical exams, they did surveys, and it was a longitudinal study. So they looked at them from a certain age all the way to adulthood to really see, how these people progressed. Mm-hmm. And the key components of it was just, astonishing. Is the fact that adverse childhood experiences are extremely common. Almost 2/3 of people that were in the study, the participants in the study, had at least one form of adverse childhood experiences. So that's immense, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And what are POCs more prone to the experience? If so, can you explain a little bit more about why?
Of why, yeah. So
Yeah.
POC children, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yes, that is the, so like, when you look at the distribution in the United States, this is where I work. So this is kind of where most of my information is from, but like almost 50% of Black children, almost 50% of Latinx children have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, mm-hmm. compared to 40% of white American children. And that is not something that should be shocking, because BIPOC communities, there are just high rates of trauma, high rates of disadvantage. We see high rates of unemployment. We see fewer educational opportunities, higher rates of crime in BIPOC communities, high rates of domestic assault, high rates of food scarcity. These are all factors that can lead to trauma in children. So in fact, about 31% of Black children and about 29% of Latinx children are living in poverty, and poverty is traumatic. So the things that I just described are actually called the social determinants of health. They're actually environmental factors that have an effect on our health. So the places that we live, the place we're born, the place that we go to school, all have an effect on our health. In fact, I used to live in an area that didn't have streetlights at night. So you can imagine that an area that doesn't have streetlights, that just creates a feeling of fear. Not that I was ever actually hurt in that environment, but because there were no streetlights, I was always fearful walking home at night. So what did I do? I didn't want to go out at night. Mm-hmm. So those type of adaptive changes actually caused mental health harm for me. So that even the physical environments have an impact on our mental health.
Yeah, definitely. I want to speak on that just briefly. My fiance grew up in an area of Toronto that wasn't really that safe. Mm-hmm. So he experienced seeing a car slow down to do a drive-by. He experienced seeing somebody dead on the side of the road. He mm-hmm. saw those things. So now he talks to me and he's like, oh, like when you go to a restaurant, you don't check like where the exits are? I'm like, no, I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. I don't think about those things, you know what I mean? So it's interesting how it really manifests even for a person that looks like they're doing well, feeling well, and have gone through all these things and overcome them, little adaptive ways that they're changing to avoid having it happen again.
Yep, totally. And I think I talked about how trauma, the most common symptoms, or the most common manifestations are acute stress disorder and PTSD. But we actually find that trauma can manifest its way in many different forms. And one of them is actually obsessive compulsive disorder, where we can like obsess about something, like our fear in a restaurant, and it be compulsed and not really feel, you know, calm unless we compulsively check around, right? So trauma is like the origin for so much mental health problems, for sure.
So as a village of mothers and many future mothers, how can we assist in preventing ACE amongst our own children?
You know, it's really, it's kind of a tough one on that way, because it's really hard for people to change their exact environment. It's a lot of pressure, right? Particularly people who are in concentrated disadvantage. It's very hard to achieve social mobility because of the oppression that we are under. But what I will say is that knowledge is power, and knowing the most common adverse childhood experiences and making sure that if your child has experienced one of those, to make sure they get the right help. Kids just don't have the vocabulary or the know-how to tell you or explain to you their mental health issues, or tell you if they're having a difficulty. So just because your kid isn't saying anything, don't assume that they are okay. So if they have gone through, experienced domestic violence, if they have, you know, lived in a house with a person who has substance abuse or extreme mental illness, if they've gone through a separation or divorce, those are the type of things, the type of events, just take them to the primary care doctor, the pediatrician, maybe make an appointment with the therapist if you have access to that, just to do an assessment to see if they're okay. And that is, you know, I would say good enough, because there's so many times where it's very, very difficult to avoid trauma because of, you know, just the concentrated disadvantage that the Black community faces.
Yeah, honestly, and I struggle with that. I want to be able to control that. You know what I mean? As a child, a person dealing with childhood trauma, I want to avoid that at all costs for my daughter. I have a 13-year-old, and I find myself sometimes low key obsessing over the fact that I need to keep her safe, or I need
Yeah.
to make sure she has the greatest ability to, you know, see all the healthy things. So like my relationship, I'm like, let's not argue too much in front of her, or like if we do argue, do it healthy. You know, there's certain things that I obsess over, which in turn has structured a beautiful household, one of which I would have definitely benefited from, but it's an obsession.
Yeah.
And I feel like, especially for future parents and parents right now that are here with us, don't beat yourself up. Things happen. There could be things happening that you don't even know about, and it's crazy to think that you can't just control everything happening with your child. But you know, they go out into the world, and at the end of the day, they are going to be an adult, and things may happen. But it's what we do after. It's what we do after to make sure that we're supporting them in the right way and not gaslighting. You know, that's a big thing that we do in our community. You know, like just hearing family in the Caribbean being like, oh, that person's crazy. You know, just dismissing it. But, you know, if we do the right thing and make sure that they're heard and supported, I think we'll still have a healthy adult in our children.
Yeah. And like, I want to bring it back to my childhood too, is like, my parents always tried to instill a lot of strength in me. And when I would be sad, as I said, I didn't want to go to them because I felt shame. And I think would have been more healthy if they were to like hold space for me when I was feeling emotions, so that if I was feeling sad, rather than just telling me you're strong, you can do this, you don't need them, just allowing me to be sad, asking me how that felt to be sad, asking me, you know, where those feelings were originating from, just holding space for my emotion so that later in life I didn't feel like I had to hide my emotions. You know, I don't think that kids are allowed to feel as many emotions as they should. And then, of course, that causes adults who are very closed off.
Yeah, definitely. Just a quick ad, because that's real. A lot of parents, I think, do that just because they don't know where to even begin to support. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's all that they probably wanted to hear, so they're just trying to instill it on us.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, as a second generation emotional child, it feels like gaslighting in a sense.
Yeah.
So definitely. Now I want to ask a last question to the chat. Has anyone had experience with inner child connection for healing? For myself, I talked a lot about riding bikes. That's a big one. Going for walks. What else do I like to do? Just amusement parks. I mean, when the world returns, amusement parks, like going on roller coasters. I'm a big kid. I'm a huge kid.
I love that. I can't
Yes, and
that thing in my stomach, it hurts too much.
ooh,
I can't do it.
so it's funny. I didn't like it until I was 24.
Oh,
But
okay.
then I went with my family and they were like, listen, we're doing this. Unless you just want to watch us, you need to do it too. So I was like, all right. And then it was just an addiction.
Yeah.
I love
You love the thrill. I love it too.
I love the thrill, you know, while I can. So somebody said painting and dancing. I love that.
I love it.
Oh, somebody else said painting and dancing. I love, you guys should meet. I love that. Y'all need to connect.
Important to me too, because my father would always play like reggae in the house. So like I would always up to music. And so I love that. Music is totally like cathartic to me. As soon as I wake up, it's either a podcast or music so that I can just like feel whole or normal.
Yes.
Probably again,
Yes.
child's connection.
Yes. Roller skating for another. I could feel you on the music thing. Kim and I are huge on music for our self-care, especially when we're, you know, feeling like we need to recharge. A good R&B playlist will get it there. Somebody said being outdoors. Oh, playing soca. Yes. I do know this soca queen in our chat. Definitely a big one. Music. Love it.
Yeah.
So could inner child healing work? Okay, sorry. Could inner child work cause re-traumatization in adults? If yes, how so?
Right. So when I think about re-traumatization, you know, it often happens with people who have acute stress disorder or PTSD. And it's not that they have, you know, the exact same trauma that just happens to them in the same scenario. It can be anything that's very reminiscent of that last trauma that then ignites, you know, the exact same emotion within them. So if somebody has a trauma from their childhood and they start to go on that journey to try and delve into it, but they aren't ready yet, it can definitely re-traumatize them. I would say that before going on that journey, it's really important to have solid practice coping skills that you can employ when your body starts to get too activated or too hyper aroused. Because if you're not able to control that, you can activate the exact same response that happened at that time that you were re-traumatized. Because as I said, that trauma is frozen in your body. So it's still there, ready to be activated at any time.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, okay. Well, so do you suggest that we speak to a mental health professional when we begin this healing process, or could we start on our own with that proper coping the tools to cope.
Yeah. So I think that the process to healing is going to be different depending on your access. I mean, I don't think that everybody needs to have a mental health professional, because unfortunately that's just not possible. It's very hard for you to find a therapist that you want to feel vulnerable with. It's very hard for you to get a therapist that you can even afford, because, you know, it is just very difficult. So I would hate to say that the only way for you to start that process is if you have a mental health professional. But what I
Oh, it looks like we lost Dr. Chanelle. While she gets connected, let me know, what have you been doing to kind of get yourself ready to cope with your inner child trauma? What are some things that you've been implementing to feel better? For myself, it's therapy. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of self-help, speaking to people in safe spaces, speaking my mind about my trauma. While she gets more connected, please let me know. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys are doing in this time. One of the things that I learned to do was in 2014, I decided that, okay, I was done just living in the trauma. I was like, listen, I need to do something. So I went to therapy, and my first session was like just blurting out everything. Just blurting out how I felt, the trauma, who hurt me. And I was like, okay, so fix me. And he's like, oh no, you need to fix yourself.
I'm back.
You're back, you're
Guys.
back. So somebody was
Oh
saying
my
that
goodness.
they meditate, they're doing little things to start having a toolkit for coping, like meditation, journaling.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that's what I wanted to kind of get to, is that maybe you can't necessarily start to dive very deep into that unconscious mind to uncover the inner child or the inner trauma. But what you can do is address some of those common symptoms associated with trauma, like having a pessimistic view of the world, or having difficulty with your sleep, or feeling hyper aroused or keyed up, you know. Gratitude journaling. It's amazing for trying to reorganize how you view the world, moving away from a pessimistic view to a more optimistic view. Adopting sleep hygiene. There's like 15 different sleep hygiene techniques that you can start to use to improve your sleep patterns. And yeah, just like as she said, using yoga, mindfulness practices to address that hyperarousal. So there's a lot of things that people can do to take ownership and agency over that trauma.
100%. I love that.
Oh, actually, one more thing.
Yes.
There's also a lot of really great self-help books. I don't know if anybody to using those. So one great self-help book to really understanding the body's trauma response is The Body Keeps the Score.
Body Keeps the Score.
By Bessel Landerkolk. So he's like the genius behind understanding how trauma lives in the body. So that's a great book. And then another great workbook is actually created by Aaron Beck. So Aaron Beck is a therapist who created the therapy called CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And he has a workbook that's specific for PTSD and anxiety.
Amazing. So lastly, can you share any tips or exercises that we can implement to bring our inner child healing process to light?
Yeah. So this is a journey into the unconscious mind, right? To really uncover some of those inner child experiences that are affecting us today. And if you're going to do that alone, I would say that the best thing for you to do to adopt is journaling. So there's different types of journaling. Some use prompts, which are really great because it gives you a reason to write in that page. But I would suggest that one of the best forms of journaling to try and uncover your conscious mind is actually called stream of consciousness writing.
Mm.
You heard of that?
No, can you talk a little bit more about that? I need to know.
So the best thing to do is actually to kind of meditate or do a breathing exercise to really calm yourself before you go into the journaling process. And then you, on a blank sheet of paper, maybe like 4 pages, really push yourself to do 4. You write anything that comes to mind. And with time, if you continue doing this process of the meditation, breath work, and then the stream of consciousness writing, you're going to start to uncover things. You'll start to uncover patterns of where your mind goes. And then you have to do the process of trying to really understand, why are my behaviors, why is my mind going there? And I would say that the best thing is to try to make connections between your childhood and that current state of mental process.
I love that. I have to try that. Honestly, I've been doing all these like Alex L self-affirmations and like, she's the homegirl. I need to know her. But those were the things that I've been working on at home. And that one right there is something I definitely need to try. So I want to go into the Q&A portion of this where you guys really get to, you know, have Dr. Chanelle all to yourself. Ask any questions that you need to ask. There was one that I missed, and that was, is there ever times when you should leave things alone? Maybe you shouldn't try to heal from it. Maybe you should just let it be.
I would say that, you know where that takes me to is actually usually the first encounter that I had with somebody who has experienced trauma, my first intake. And I think that a lot of people think that on your first assessment with a therapist, you have to dive deep. And the truth is that that's really traumatic for somebody. Until that person has a safe space where they can truly feel vulnerable, where they have the right coping skills so that they can handle that trauma, until that happens, I would never say that you should just dive deep. In fact, one of the most important things about doing trauma work is really feeling like you are ready and having that resiliency and the resources to know that you are ready to embark on that journey to understanding your trauma and doing the work. And it's okay if right now you aren't ready. But I would say that you can go on that journey to start preparing yourself, building up that resiliency to one day be ready to do it. So just be kind to yourself. We don't all have to, you know, heal in the moment, heal right now, right? It's a journey for everybody.
That's it. And I think a lot of times, especially with social media, and especially if you have the following I have like psychiatrists, therapists, millennial therapy, all these things. And I'm like, okay, I need to fix myself. I need to work on myself this week. And it could get a little overwhelming, to be honest. You start to feel like you're letting yourself down if you don't do exactly what somebody on IG says. So it's
intense. We're all in a pandemic, but everyone's apparently doing amazingly. And that's just not the case, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Somebody says, where does it cross the line from honoring trauma to living in victimhood? Great question.
That is a really good question. So I would say that honoring trauma is really doing the work, you know, not necessarily having to delve right into trauma, but starting to do the work to get ready to talk about trauma and then really committing to it. But victimhood would actually be kind of identifying with the trauma, saying that like this is a part of my identity and my behaviors stem from it, and the behaviors that I do are justified because of the trauma that happened. And that it really is not the case. So one side, the honoring trauma, is understanding. Then victimhood or living in victimhood is more like blaming your trauma and not taking responsibility for your actions.
Yeah, you're saying some real stuff, because when I started therapy, I was telling everybody, I just wanted to unload like trauma. I have it. Like, tell me, fix me, do something. And he's like, it's on you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, you have to do the work. And I'm like, oh, sir, like, you know, do the work for me. This is what I'm here for.
Yeah, what's going on here? Do the
Yeah,
work I come.
it's super rude. And I think that's the thing too. Like, you have to realize that this is self-work. Even if you talk through it with therapy, there might be things that are uncovered, but it's really for you to sit down and figure out how to keep that trauma at bay after you heal from it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in my own form of therapy, and the form of therapy that I wanted to do was psychoanalysis. And so this is a very specific type of therapy that believes that most of our emotions, behaviors, and motivations for life stem from memories in our unconscious mind. And so I really wanted to understand my unconscious mind. I mean, it's vast. You know that image of the iceberg? So
Mm.
like this would be the conscious mind, and underneath here is the unconscious mind. So I wanted to play in that realm. And I was in therapy for like a year and a half, and I was like, what am I doing here? Nothing's changing. But what's really great about psychoanalysis and understanding your unconscious mind is that it has nothing to do with your therapist changing your behavior. What it does is gives you self-awareness, so that if you are confronted with the same situation, you can decide, do I want to do it the same way I've always done it? Do the
Yeah.
same pattern of unhealthiness that I've always done? Or do I want to adapt another healthy way to address it? You
Yeah,
know? Um,
exactly
yeah,
it.
just
I
empowerment, self-awareness.
Yeah, I remember just complaining about somebody constantly overstepping boundaries. And they're like, but hold on, you never even set a boundary. So how do they know that you don't like, that you are going to change anything? You
Mm-hmm.
haven't told them to change. And I'm like, again, you know, you leave therapy sometimes very upset,
Yeah.
but it's real.
There's a misconception that, the therapeutic process is this beautiful linear, oh, you're feeling great, it is a roller coaster. And there are some times when you're feeling so great, and then there'll be weeks when you're just feeling so down. And that's when a lot of people, they end up leaving it. But I hope that you are strong enough to do it. And if you can maintain those down times during therapy, the ups will be even better, truly.
Yeah, that's real.
Yeah.
How do you have positive relationships as an adult with parents, authority figures that have experienced childhood trauma, that you've experienced childhood trauma with?
Hmm.
Mm,
Very good question.
yeah.
So, an important part of our childhood, like such an important part of our childhood, is our relationships with our early caregivers. So, there was this psychologist called Bowlby. He was this British psychologist, and he, studied early childhood experiences. And he found that there are about 4 different attachment styles. Have you heard of the attachment styles for children? So, of course, the healthy attachment style with a caregiver is one where you can really rely on that caregiver. So in times where maybe you're feeling hurt, you know that you can rely on that person. And healthy attachment styles in adulthood and childhood usually allow healthy relationships, healthy friendships, healthy, romantic partners. But kind of what you're describing here, it seems like there was an unhealthy attachment in care to your caregiver in childhood. And so to really try and heal from that, it's so important to start delving in and processing that early attachment dynamic with your with your parent to really try and understand it. Because as I said, understanding those things is self-awareness and its power, and it will allow you to recognize patterns and to not fall into those same ones in adulthood.
And do you suggest that they speak to their parent about the trauma that they may have caused?
You know, that is an interesting, I sometimes that could be re-traumatizing because not everybody is ready to embark on that journey. And so if they're not ready, that can be really hurtful. It can be very dismissive. And I'm just not sure that you can rely or you can even put that pressure on somebody just yet, you know? But if that parent is ready for it, I think it'd be very therapeutic for both the child and the caregiver to kind of talk about the trauma that happened as a child, if the caregiver is ready. Yeah.
That's real advice. Thank you for that. Last question. I'm curious about healing and processing trauma that is inherited from ancestral trauma, but does it still live in our bodies?
So this is a great topic of intergenerational trauma. One thing that I've been learning about is that the Black community has had such a long history of trauma, and these can be passed down actually in our genetics, but they can also be passed down by behaviors. So, for example, the example that I told you about the living from a place of scarcity that a lot of immigrants live in, right? That type of behavior is passed down from generations because you see how your parents live from a place of scarcity. And so healing from that trauma is really having to recognize what are some of those behaviors and adaptations that really helped maybe my parents, but they're not really useful to me anymore, and they might actually be maladaptive, because a lot of what we need to be looking at is being in a place of abundance, that there's an immense wealth that we can attach onto, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Dr. Chanelle, thank you so much for instilling your wisdom on us. Honestly, this was everything I needed. I've been talking a lot to my friends about inner child work, but I didn't really know the science behind it. So you've really kind of helped me clarify what my journey needs to look like. Can you tell us a little bit about how we can find you? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram?
Yeah, of course. So you can actually find me on Instagram. That's kind of the platform that I'm mainly using. And my handle is at Dr. Shanelle MD. And I center, the BIPOC community when I talk about mental health, because I do believe that there is a huge need in that community. So I really hope that you guys can follow me and we can continue this conversation.
Definitely. She's been dropping gems that I've had to repost because I feel them, honestly. So thank you so much for that. Before we go, I do have a book recommendation of my own. It's called The Drama of the Gifted Child: The Search for the True Self. This is something that my therapist asked me to read after I was, talking about my traumas. And it really talks about how you can, overcome them and heal from them, despite the external influences around you.
I'd have to read that one too. I'm going to get it on audio.
Definitely read it. It's on Amazon. I put a little Amazon link there for our friends in Canada. Sorry, friends in the US, my bad. So where can you find this conversation? If she drops some gems that you haven't written down, you can watch this again. We will have it on our YouTube channel, and you can see all the other past Villij Talks as well. So we've spoken to people like nutritionists, naturopathic doctors. We've done quite a few by now. So definitely dive in. And again, Dr. Chanelle, I can't wait to do this again. This
please.
Yeah, we need
Love
to,
it.
100%. Our community needs you. So we appreciate the work that you're doing, and we look forward to connecting again.